My name is Kieran Wong. I'm the chair of Shelter WA, and thank you to you all for joining and attending today's launch. Shelter WA is the peak body for social and affordable housing and ending homelessness in WA, and our vision is that all people have housing that enables them to thrive. I'd like to welcome you today to the launch of Reimagining Indigenous Housing, Health and Wealth Report, the necessary ecological response to unlock the potential of the Indigenous Estate by Professor Karabena, Chris Holland and Shane Hamilton. Shelter WA was pleased to receive funding from the Federal Department of Health for this project, and we were delighted to work with Adrian Pizarski from National Shelter, Ivan Simon from the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Housing Association, and Gordon Cole, Chair of Noongar Maya Maya and member of the Shelter WA board, to commission this report. It was critical to us that this work was undertaken by First Nations organisations and led by First Nations researchers. And the outcome is a seminal report that will shift our thinking on the relationship between housing, health and wealth. And I would like to thank Professor Karabena and everybody involved in this project for their contribution to this report. The order of today's session launch is we'll start with an acknowledgement of country from Ivan Simon, acknowledging that we're all on different countries. Then there'll be a project overview by Adrian Pizarski, and then Professor Karabena will provide an overview of the report and allow a short Q&A session at the end. Adrian will then outline the next steps to bring this report to life, and hopefully it does have a long life. So I would now like to invite Ivan Simon from the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Housing Association for an acknowledgement of country. Ivan, over to you.
Thanks, Kieran. Just before I do that acknowledgement, I just also like to let people know where I come from. I grew up at a little place called La Perouse, which is directly across from on the peninsula of Botany Bay, across from where Captain Cook landed, actually. But my mother's people are Stuarts from down the far south coast, from Wallaga Lake village and all the surrounds. And my dad is a Warramai person from lovely fishing village of Foster, Tuncurry. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land wherever you're located. Can I also acknowledge our elders past, present and emerging. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm sure there's no need to argue about that point. And we're more than happy to share it with everybody. We just hope government gets its head around that issue, that we're happy to share. As long as we have input to things, and I think this this report and this really important work will pick up those issues and really test the thinking. We've got to find a different way of doing things. We can't keep doing the same old, same old. So I'd like to personally welcome everybody, distinguished guests. I saw the list. And also acknowledge the great work that people that were engaged and contracted to do it, and the involvement that a whole lot of people have had. So I'll hand it back over to Kieran and welcome everybody to today's very important launch.
Thank you, Ivan. And so we might go straight to you, Adrian, for an overview of the project itself.
And just a bit about National Shelter. We're the national peak advocating for better housing policy, particularly with an interest in low-income households. In terms of this project, we've been part of the governance group. The project was funded by the Department of Health and Ageing through a particular arrangement that came about through relationships that Shelter WA had, and that's really the genesis of why Shelter WA was the auspice body for the overall project. The governance group was really keen to make sure that this was an Aboriginal-led and written project. shelters have a role in this space, but we are there as supporters and fellow travellers in the trenches with, if you like, rather than trying to lead anything in this space. We're just strong supporters. So we were very keen to make sure that the project was Aboriginal led. So we put out a tender, and the result of that tender was that PwC's Indigenous Consulting Group was chosen to do the report, to conduct the consultation, look at the history of health and housing, and present and prepare the report. In just giving you this overview, I just want to state that for me, it's one of the most exciting reports that I've read. I read a lot of reports. There's very few of them that grab me from the opening line, and this one certainly does. It is really deeply rooted in, and I notice Kerry's just joined us, so welcome, Kerry. That's nice to see. It is really deeply rooted in Aboriginal Australia from the very first line in the report, and it's a really good history of the policies around health and housing and the interaction on that. But it's an exciting conceptual approach based on Aboriginal community control and the creation of wealth rather than the focus on welfare as an approach to housing Aboriginal people in the future. I think it requires governments to consider how to accommodate Aboriginal thinking and approaches to health and housing rather than the general approach that we've had, which demands that Aboriginal people and organisations fit with current ways of doing things. So it's a conceptual report. It's a really stimulating report. It gets the brain engaged to really tackle this issue. So we will commend it. I will speak more about the next steps that we will use to promote the report following the briefing from Kerry. But I just wanted to give you that very brief overview of how the report came about, what we think it's about, the fact that it is Aboriginal led and that it is deeply rooted in Aboriginal approaches to the issue of health and housing. So I'll go back to you, Kieran, and thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Adrian. And Kerry has arrived. Fantastic, fantastic. So without further ado, Kerry, I might hand to you to provide an overview, to provide the presentation of the report, and after that we'll have a short Q&A. And you're on mute, the classic line of 2020.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, everybody. My apologies. I can see amongst the group here quite a few shining and smiling faces because I managed to make it on time. However, my brother Shane Hamilton is shining up at the screen from me, who is also a co-author on this report. And we are just very delighted to be able to present this to you today. As is our custom, I would first of all like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the many lands on which we're meeting today and pay a very deep and sincere respect to elders past, present and emerging. And I am also delighted for all of you to give this time to have this discussion about how we can reimagine Indigenous housing, health and wealth. What we have done is adopt a very necessary ecological response to unlock the potential in the Indigenous estate, and that requires all of us to reconceptualise what it means to live well, to live long, to live in place, to live under shelter, and in ways that can mobilise what it is that we have aspirations for over the coming years as we enter deeply into the 21st century. And so what I'm going to do now is just have a bit of a discussion with you about the kinds of different experiences that were integrated into the development of this report. First of all, I'm working with First 1000 Days Australia concepts, which really focuses in on the experience of children from conception to a child's second birthday. That for us led into work with Aboriginal Housing Victoria, where we were able to engage peer researchers in helping the Housing Commission become much more than just a landlord, and to really work on improving the social, emotional and cultural wellbeing outcomes for people in their houses and who are members of their own community. We also did a lot of work in Country Can't Hear English, which focuses in very strongly on the cultural determinants of health and wellbeing, again, very deeply embedded in ecological approaches to this work. We've also done work looking at epigenetics and the Indigenous metagenomics strategy, which looks at the molecular ways in which we needed to decolonise, but how housing and housing infrastructure is essential for that notion. We've also then really focused in on our deep housing experience, and Shane Hamilton, previously the CEO of New South Wales Housing Associations, we did a lot of consultations with housing organisations all over Australia. We facilitated a number of different workshops, particularly one where we had the intersections between health and housing really well understood in Darwin. I was the independent chair of Victoria's Housing and Homelessness Program, which has now seen a movement at a state-based level of a social housing-driven infrastructure and economic recovery. And I'm deeply grateful for the chance to work with Michelle and others at the National Housing Scheme, and particularly the work that was able to be done with WA housing associations. And I'm really deeply grateful to Michelle for also then using Karabena Consulting's publishing company to produce the report. In terms of what it is that we've been able to really embed in this reconceptualisation of housing are these very deep, integrated ways of understanding the world that are embedded in Indigenous sciences. And we did that because Australia's First Nations peoples, as the continuing culture, which is recognised internationally now as the oldest living culture on Earth, is also one of the most ecologically sensitive civilizations on the planet. And so to not reflect those ideas and concepts in our work would have been remiss of us, and it would have not given due acknowledgement of our knowledge and our traditions, particularly about our ways of knowing, being and doing. And so what we've also really understood housing to be is a mechanism through which we can embed healing practices and traditions to not only move from trauma and welfarist approaches, but to really help to consolidate our collective identity and sense of cultural continuity, because these are the mainstays of our cultures since time out of mind. So we were able to really build those kinds of conceptualizations into the body of the report. And whilst we focus on health and well-being, what's not well understood is that we also arguably have the world's oldest examples of architecture on this continent. And in terms of traditional Indigenous architecture and urban design principles, we have got an architectural tradition which is not only about built structure, but is both health-giving and sustaining. And those kinds of mechanisms, that architecture and infrastructure, has been the platform for our cultural continuity for thousands and thousands of years. And we've seen fantastic examples of this, particularly in the northern part of Australia with the Nawala Gavan Mung, which is over 40,000 years old and has been recognised as the stonemasons, by stonemasons internationally, as the oldest recorded example of a shelter, which has 36 pillars to hold up the roof. And this 19 metre by 19 metre structure was excavated by our ancestors, and its definition is as one of the oldest examples of our species masonry. And it is also stunningly decorated with some of the world's oldest rock art. And so to think that housing is a fairly new phenomenon for us is something that we really want to disrupt through the reconceptualization as evidenced in this paper. Some of the traditional requirements that we understood were met really were embedded in cultural perspectives, and our built infrastructure was very strongly culturally aligned in that we did have designated shelters for older men and single women. Young boys and young girls were accommodated according to their cultural and ceremonial requirements within their kinship systems. We had segregated housing for males and females prior to initiation ceremonies, and we were able to store in them our ritual objects. And we are also able to accommodate the sacred dimensions of men's and women's business and requiring the built layout of our infrastructure to necessitate the separation and the different directions that were accommodating avoidance relationships. And it's very rare that we will see built design accommodate and encapsulate some of those really important perspectives as well. What we've also done is really focus in on strength-based approaches to Indigenous communities and housing in contemporary Australia. Myself, I do not have a practice. I don't have a disciplinary base that allows me to work well with people experiencing homelessness or overcrowding and the resultant challenges that occurs for mental and physical health and well-being. My practice is very much embedded in people being housed and people not to be overcrowded, because that necessitates in lots of ways the empowerment that's needed for all Australian citizens to really engage with and embrace the multitude of opportunities that are coming online just by living in the 21st century. So some of the ways in which we've been able to work through this paper was to capture the aspirations of people, where they live, how they wanted their extended kinship families and relationships to be acknowledged, and also then to reconsider what it feels like to live in remote or discrete communities or in regional towns and major cities, many of whom have been impacted significantly by ecological degradation, changes in climate, to a point now where the refrigeration in many of the shop infrastructure in remote area communities is set at a particular level. If we have a rise of 2 centigrade above that level, then food security becomes an issue. In desert communities where I spent a lot of time living, storage of food was a real issue. We had to have flour tins strung from buckets hanging off ceilings so that it wasn't available to dogs. And so being able to promote food security through housing infrastructure was also really important. As a teenage single mum, one of the first pieces of accommodation that I was able to purchase was a caravan. I then sold that and bought my first house for my 21st birthday. And from that point, I've always owned houses rather than renting them, because I could take out mortgage protection insurance so that if anything happened to me, and I did fly around in a lot of single-engined aircraft in my days, if anything did happen to me during that time, that at least there would be a legacy there for my children. And I could not have left my full-time job as a professor at the University of Melbourne to become an entrepreneur had I not had access to internet, to a place where I could think and work, and all of those kinds of necessities that during COVID have really exemplified the importance of houses as economic infrastructure that helps us stabilise our families as well as contribute to our own communities and the wider communities too. But what we've also really been able to embed in this work is the principle of abundance. The abundance absolutely was how we lived our lives within our Indigenous estate. So what we feel now is the physical and mental health impacts of colonisation which persist today. whereas our pre-contact Indigenous populations, the estimations are now that there were up to 6 million Indigenous Australians living on this continent in pre-contact times. We've now seen evidence of superhighways which mobilised people across this continent from Saul days, when we crossed the Wombok line and became the first in our species that were not predated on by major megaflora and fauna. And because of that, we were able to extend these ideas of ecological managerialism, which persists today. And we were at least as healthy, if not more healthy, than our coloniser-to-be counterparts at the time when we were colonised. And because of the Indigenous estate and how we were able to express ourselves in it, we were able to work for a short space of time, and then the rest of our time and life was giving over to leisure, to philosophy, to enact on the principles of abundance through health-giving practices and social emotional well-being that absolutely was encapsulated in much of our architecture and health-giving infrastructure, very ecologically designed, actually powered in a way which didn't require metal implements. It did not require the use of electricity. It did not require many things that we take for granted and the pollutants that we take for granted in the supply chain of developing and investing in built environments. So all of those things were incredibly important for all of us to reconceptualize in this report. And certainly the conversations between myself, Chris Holland, who is another fantastic contributor to this document, and Shane were really about emanating this principle of abundance. And I'm delighted to say that this principle is now being manifest in the work that we're doing through Ignite, which is an Indigenous consortium of our businesses that are looking to infiltrate and manifest Indigenous to Indigenous trade through all the free trade agreements. We've been able to re-embrace the idea of abundance, not only in built infrastructure, but in engaging with our ecological footprint, which was much larger than the landmass on which we currently live. The other thing that's really important for us to know and is deeply engaged with through this report was that the colonisers' population gain of the original Indigenous estate came at the Indigenous cost. The cost of the gains that were made through land clearing was that the only costs borne of that experience were the Indigenous peoples and the Indigenous estate. In that what's happened in our experience of homelessness, that occurred 230 plus years ago, when tens of thousands of Indigenous peoples from varying countries and with varying languages and cultures were removed from their experience of the most economically productive parts of the Indigenous estate to make way for white people's nation building experiences. So while Australia's colonising population has now been able to accumulate over $10 trillion worth of wealth, much of which is invested and in built infrastructure, the Indigenous parents and grandparents were mobilised out of these productive areas. We were not able to benefit from wages on working on lands that were then owned by others that we were then able to work on because of the stolen wages. And what we've now got is this rapidly growing colonial and state economies, and all of the education, employment, and wealth generating opportunities has absolutely been only at the cost of Indigenous peoples and the Indigenous estate. So our experiences of homelessness occurred over 230 years ago, and the resilience of our people is now shown in the fact that we are still here, we're still representing, and it's manifest now as the housing gap. So in 2019, Indigenous Australians, when compared to most other Australians, were about half likely to own their own home, 10 times as likely to live in social housing, 3 times as likely to live in overcrowded dwellings, and significantly more likely to live in a home requiring significant maintenance or repairs, and 9 times as likely to access specialist homelessness services. That has also manifest in a health gap, where the Indigenous population born between 2015 and 17 has a lower life expectancy of about 8.6 years than their non-Indigenous counterparts for males and 7.86 years for females. And the single biggest killer of Indigenous peoples are chronic diseases, particularly cardiovascular disease. And we are seeing more and more of the trauma-induced mental health gap, which is increasingly appreciated as a driver of other inequities. And we're also seeing high and very high rates of psychological distress and hospitalisation, particularly for non-Indigenous males and females. And those rates are again at a higher rate than our non-Indigenous counterparts. What we really want you to also understand is that there is nowhere in Australia do Indigenous populations have relatively equal socioeconomic status compared with the non-Indigenous populations. And that in 2014 and 15, the median equivalised gross weekly household income for Indigenous adults was $542 compared with $852 for non-Indigenous Australians. So not only was our land stolen, we have been forced out into the economically unproductive lands. We have been outside of a buoyant market economy, and there have been passive economies through intergenerational welfare dependencies. And not only that, but we are now operating as less wealth per household than our non-Indigenous counterparts, again, who have been the primary beneficiaries in the colonial process. So how we're seeing these gaps expressed today is also being expressed through our housing, where we have intergenerationally transmitted trauma. We are starting to see overrepresentation of our children in child protection systems. We are seeing homelessness and people being further removed from the ability to own their own home or purchase their own home. We are starting to see the biological expressions of these experiences through epigenetics and the parent-child genetic inheritance of trauma symptoms. We're seeing the exacerbation of family violence and problematic use of alcohol and drug use. And there is a strong association between trauma and homelessness, where there are so many of our clients accessing specialist homelessness services, reported 1 or more family violence experiences, mental health issues, and problematic alcohol and drug use. And they are the reasons why they're seeking safely. And so in terms of what this means for the housing workforce is that we really do need to focus in on trauma-informed practice in our home and homelessness services. Basically, we've had the largest land grab in human history, and that is the genesis of Indigenous people's experiences of homelessness today. These past negative legacies have not been recognised or proactively reversed, and it's now almost 30 years since the High Court recognised native title rights existed in Australia from pre-contact times, and that there has been an unbroken connection to the Indigenous estate and the usage and interests of the Indigenous estate. Based on that, we have over 35% of the Australian landmass, which is under Indigenous care because it has been regained by traditional owners, and it is the single largest contributor to the ongoing restoration of the Indigenous estate is our peoples. There are over 500 claims remaining, And if they are all able to come through, then by 2030, Indigenous Australians will have control over 52% of the land mass of the Australian nation. Some of the doors to restitution have already been closed, but what remains of the Indigenous state in terms of economically productive land in the 21st century, with the advent of renewables, carbon sinking, different ways of participating in economies and economy, is perhaps what the opportunities are going forward, where we get a chance to reverse the remnants of perhaps the largest land grab in world history, which has been the colonising of this land mass we now call Australia. So in terms of what it is that we're recommending through this report, maximising Indigenous self-determination, including creating the goals of health, wealth and housing combined together. We've also then got the opportunity to close the Indigenous personal wealth gap by connecting Indigenous individuals, families and communities to the Australian wealth system and to home ownership, and to also then close the Indigenous population wealth gap and achieve financial independence by a thriving Indigenous controlled Indigenous estate-based economy and Indigenous housing pool by further expanding both of those things. What we wanted to do was ensure that Indigenous populations have stable, affordable and high quality housing by maximising home ownership, eliminating racial discrimination and unlocking the potentials within the Indigenous housing pool. We also set a target for a zero Indigenous homelessness, including by a trauma-aware and informed Indigenous housing pool that becomes a gateway for trauma reduction programs, and also then by closing the Indigenous health gap using the levers of housing, community planning and household, community and population wealth creation, and to really embed in that the opportunities to strengthen culture, social and emotional well-being and mental health and well-being. We also then wanted to think about what a national housing pool strategy could look like. And in terms of that, what our proposal is to increase the supply by adding to the Indigenous housing pool and maintaining Indigenous stock or existing stock, to transition from housing into new builds, and to also then promote opportunities to work across the housing spectrum to free up dwellings in the Indigenous housing pool with a goal of being able to house all homeless Indigenous peoples and households. That will require us to use surplus Indigenous housing pool stock from the above to house people, and to also then work towards preventing Indigenous homelessness by trauma-informed housing sectoral responses, really taking into account the development of works to address the mental health and well-being, the epigenetics, and to really utilise culture-based strategies, including connecting through supply chains. And so what we've done in Indigenous businesses is to really think through what that could look like, that a dwelling or a community is connected to our water supplies, to a stable and consistent electricity supply, and those things become the non-negotiables of the Indigenous housing and Indigenous estate, and to also then propose a broadening of that view to include the ecologies in which we live, to really consider then family, kin and culture, to connect to the health supply, which is health services, food and recreational facilities, and to also then connect to a wealth supply, which is predominantly now based in our experiences of accessing internet, employment, training and enterprise. What we're also then looking at doing is really following through on place-based strategies for health and mental health services, accessible trauma-aware and trauma-informed services for homelessness preventing services, and to really help facilitate trauma healing, again embedded in our Indigenous estate, to target community-based communicable disease elimination programs to close particular health gaps but also then to really innovate what new Indigenous housing and community design codes could look like to support well-being and well-being supportive structures and communities, and to also then mitigate foreseeable climate change associated challenges to health supporting capabilities of our current and future Indigenous housing pools and to Indigenous housing in general. Our wealth creation strategies is something that I would like to think I'm an exemplar of, in that I used to leave my house to go to work. I now work predominantly from my house and have extended my house to include an office that other people now come into. In order of that, I need to have internet. I need the ability to think, which means that my house is not overcrowded. And I've also then been able to regulate my own mental health and well-being in the context of my house. It is no good to talk to traditional owners about what it is that they can do economically without talking to them about what their housing aspirations are through which they can manifest their own wealth creation opportunities. And so what that means then is to really start to understand and advocate for financial independence, collective self-determination. Perhaps that manifests as collective home ownership, and also then build in multiple level life controls, including those that eliminate racism, and also then really focus in on education, employment, and entrepreneurial opportunities. These things will and are so important to build into the housing, health, and wealth creation strategies to really unlock the potential of the Indigenous state as we move into the 21st century. And it really does then require us not to think about housing, but how do we give people a home? How can we support people to move into a home? What does it mean to own a home rather than live in a house? Because those are the sorts of things that are really critical for all of us. So in terms of what this report does advocate for, they are a bit out there, but they are evidence informed, they are future looking, they are immersive in that they are bringing everything to bear in the context of the ecologies that are tied to language and are part of our Indigenous estate, and then really focusing in on the collective elements of what that looks like in terms of family kin culture, health services, food, recreational facilities, and again, that health and wealth building infrastructure. What we are advocating for might seem difficult now, but if we all put our minds to it, then we're not always going to settle for whole of government approaches. But what we will need are whole new ways of systems operations. We're advocating for an authority to really purposefully bridge all of these different elements and connect the Indigenous estate to the Indigenous housing pool. And for the authority then to have an overview to look after the development and implementation of all of the strategies that are proposed in this conceptual piece, including to maximise economic potential in the Indigenous estate. So from that point, I will hand back over to all of you. I've probably spoken for long enough now. And if there are any questions or chats that people would have, please put them in the chat box and we'll see if we can go around answering them. So at the moment in the chat box, we have a way where you can find the copy of the report. We've also done a summary document for those among us who don't like to read full reports, because you get to page 72 and just go, oh my days, I've had enough of all of that now. I'll just go back and check with the summary. Both work. The intention comes from a pure place of deep love and deep affection for all we are. We really are deeply engaged with our fellow Australians, but we do want the recognition of the benefits of the largest land grab in the world's history to be recognised, and to understand that it was from that point when legislature allowed for the land mobilisation to happen to benefit colonialists, that is when we experienced homelessness. And we are 230 years into the experience. Some of us have been able to regain, and some of us are still yearning for the opportunity to do so. So I'm going to leave it there for now, and thank you all for the opportunity to launch this wonderful piece of work. Again, I want to acknowledge Shane Hamilton and Chris Holland for their work with us in the design and the consultation processes and the writing and the conceptualization of these big ideas. And we'd be really willing to hear more from all of you about your successes in implementing this work. Thank you very much, Kieran. Back over to you.
Thank you so much, Kerry. As always, a fantastic presentation. There are actually a few questions popping up in the chat now. Have you got that window open?
I do. So
okay, great.
Thank you very much, Bethany, and for Louise. Louise, well done, Louise. Lovely to see you online. Louise works at Aboriginal Housing Victoria and has done so much in this space. I'm so proud of our organisations who work here. It's just wonderful to see. So do we have any data on home ownership in the Aboriginal versus non-Aboriginal populations? I'm sure someone does. I don't necessarily have that to hand, but if someone would like to make reference to it in the chat, please do. Would Shelter WA be willing to deliver this information to a group of clients who would benefit from this information and their services? I can't answer on behalf of Shelter WA, but I'm going to assume a big hell yes from that. So that's what I'm going to assume. I don't think it's an incorrect assumption on my part. Michelle's smiling at me on camera, so that's always a good thumbs up from me. And fantastic work. Look forward to the present. Thank you for the presentation. Look forward to sharing it widely. Thank you so much for that, Alice. That's wonderful. Wonderful to see too.
There is a question that was the first question to land, which was around the advocacy plan for this report. What is the intention to lobby and advocate for some of the concepts that you're talking about?
Might be a segue for me, Kieran.
Yes, probably a good segue to you, Adrian.
Okay. So I was going to pick up and talk about some next steps, and that's probably the best place to start. So from here, the report will be distributed on websites, both in WA and nationally, and wherever else we can get it out. We'll also be doing promotion to government, advocacy, lobbying, however you want to term that. We're planning on a trip in about the middle of June, where we want to meet with Minister Wyatt, but also other government representatives that have an interest in this, opposition and crossbenchers, Greens, etc. So we want to spread the information widely. And whilst the report is, as Kerry said, conceptual, it's rooted in some really deep principles. And what we're also doing is developing a policy response to the report. So we're doing that with Ivan at Natsiha, and we're consulting with Nacho and others about what shape that response should be, and that'll be the basis on which National Shelter, for its part, goes forward, and whoever else we can convince to support that. We'll also look to do media around this. It's nice to launch a report, but I think it's much better if we can get this conversation happening more broadly. So, there may be future opportunities where I'm hoping Kerry might pop up on the drum, or some other show that you might watch in future. It would be great to have this conversation, because whilst it is conceptual and rooted in Aboriginal thinking and experience, there does need to be practical responses to it. Conceptually, it's probably a 50 to 100 year game plan, if you like, to get to where we want to be. But practically, there are some things that governments can do. One of those is to really support Indigenous community housing organisations. And I might ask Ivan to comment here, because one of the exciting things that's happened over the last 12 months is the development of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Housing Association Alliance. I'm never sure what the A stands for, Ivan, so perhaps you can enlighten us on that as well.
Association, right? Association. Thanks, Adrian. Yeah, look, NATSI has been in the making for nearly 5 years, and it started with a strong commitment from the then Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, who's no longer in politics these days, Nigel Scullion, and it brought together a whole range of stakeholders, including yourselves as non-Indigenous organisations, as well as representatives across the country. So we've actually progressed a lot since then, even though we've only just recently been incorporated. So we've participated in a number of things, including the Close the Gap refresh process. And so, and we do have that submission available if anyone would like it, as well as a submission to the homeless inquiry as well. So we've been doing that by the smell of an oily rag, really, but with help from Adrian and Wendy Hayhurst from National Chair. We have a strong relationship with the Mainstream Community Housing System Network, so we'll be looking at their support as well for this. But in particular, in recent times, we're now very formally linked to the Coalition of Peaks, led through Pat Turner of Nacho. We have always recognised the very strong link and dependencies between housing and health. Unfortunately, a international conference that we're supposed to have a couple of years ago had a very strong theme related to that. This report, I guess, raises a whole range of interesting things. One of the things we'd like to see as a consequence is to get a serious commitment from government, particularly at a national level, and if we can get a bipartisan approach in particular to bring this report to being, because it will take quite a long time. It's like turning the Queen Mary around that huge boat that takes quite a long time to even slow down. So there's a lot of good things happening in states and territories, which is good to see, but I tend to see a lot of people tripping over each other. I tend to see a lot of gaps. I tend to see a lot of overlap, duplication, a whole lot of things. And if nothing else, if we can bring about a one-stop shop at a national level through a very specific designated organisation, such as being recommended, I think that can be, over time, nothing but positive around us really turning that big boat around and getting things done from the grassroots up. So we look forward to working with WA Shelter with this report and National Shelter, and hopefully getting the change of thinking around government at all political alliances in Canberra. So thanks, Adrian.
Thanks, Ivan. That's really useful. So they're kind of the next steps that we're considering, and we're also going to be just looking at every opportunity we can to promote the concept. It is a concept that's worth thinking about. It does engage the brain. It is a bit difficult sometimes to think about, while we understand that concept of the Indigenous estate and a national housing pool and a wealth and ecological approach to housing, health and wealth, how we practically make that a reality does require further thinking, further policy development. We're not going to let government off the hook. It isn't all about Aboriginal people doing it for themselves or leaving it up to Aboriginal people. There's always going to be a role for governments in this. And one example that I'd kind of look at is the Indigenous community housing organisations that exist all across the country have been pretty poorly treated over the last decade, particularly by the federal government and often by state governments as well. But there is a lot of land, there is a lot of housing that's currently underutilised, probably in a poor state of repair and maintenance in many cases, but does represent the kind of opportunity to really embed the idea of a housing pool. Now, that takes engagement. It takes some funding up front to actually do the capacity development and figure out the mechanics of how this would work, and especially to the satisfaction of those Aboriginal organisations that are so critical to it. So it's that kind of thinking and recommendation and policy response that we are developing and that we will be taking to government as one step. But there is a broader conceptual piece that needs to be done to think about the concept of the Aboriginal estate and how that is maximised, how that is utilised, how it connects to a national housing pool and ensures that Aboriginal people can own on whatever basis that is, that can enjoy the space and facility and amenity that Kerry outlined that she's gone down a personal journey of. That's the kind of result that we want for everybody in Australia, not just those who, you know, might be on professor salaries, but everybody on every kind of salary. So I might leave it there, Kieran, and I hope that's given people a flavour of where we're going to try and take this.
Yes, that's great. Thanks, Adrian, and thanks, Ivan. And I can see that Kerry is furiously typing into the chat box, responding to people. So thanks for that. And thank you also for the presentations. I think the insights today have been amazing. And as you say, the conceptual reframing of the Indigenous estate and the housing pool means that I think this report should have a very long life indeed. So congratulations again, Kerry, and to Shane, I can see on the line, for leading this fantastic piece of work and producing the report. And thank you all for your attendance today. It's, as has been mentioned, you can download this report from the Shelter WA website, from the National Shelter website and from the NATSIA website. And I think Kerry's also put a link into her publishing house in the chat, so you can download it from there. It's available everywhere. I have actually read the whole thing a couple of times, just I didn't get bored at page 72, just so you know. So I commend everyone to reading it many times. But before closing and thanking you all, if there's a little evaluation event feedback form that's just popped up on your screen. So if you could fill that in, it only takes a second, we'd be incredibly appreciative indeed. So thank you once again for your attendance. We're in the kind of final throes of the wrap up, and we really appreciate and look forward to progressing this work, this very important work, with many of you who are on the line today. So thank you once again, and good morning or good afternoon.